Who was Anubis? The guardian of souls in ancient Egypt, Egyptian deity. Anubis, one of the most fascinating figures in Egyptian mythology, represents much more than simply a god with the head of a jackal. For the ancient Egyptians, he was the symbol of the transition between life and death, an essential intermediary between the visible and invisible worlds. Over the centuries, this deity established itself as the guardian of the dead, a role that carries with it a sense of respect and reverence. When I think of Anubis, I imagine the importance he had in a society that valued life after death so highly. The Egyptians firmly believed that the soul continued to exist after physical death, and Anubis was responsible for guiding these souls on their journey. He was not only a protector, but also an assistant in the most delicate transitions of life. This idea that death is not an end, but a transformation, resonates deeply in many cultures around the world. Anubis is often depicted as a man with the head of a jackal, and this image carries powerful meanings. The jackal, an animal often associated with cemeteries and desert areas, symbolizes constant vigilance over the dead. The presence of this animal in art and funerary rituals reinforces the idea that death is not to be feared, but rather understood and respected. Looking at this representation, we are reminded that even in death, there is continuity and protection under the guidance of Anubis. Guardian of souls Anubis, this fascinating Egyptian deity, is much more than just a god associated with death. He is the guardian of souls, a role that carries great responsibility and meaning. In our modern culture, we often view death with fear and uncertainty, but Anubis teaches us that there is a path, a journey to be taken after life ends. He is the guide who ensures that souls find their way, providing a sense of security and protection. Imagine, for a moment, the scene in ancient Egypt. Funeral rituals were moments of deep reverence, where the living said goodbye to their loved ones, knowing that Anubis was there, watching over them. As the guardian of souls, his presence was a relief to those who feared the unknown. He ensured that spirits were not lost, but rather that they passed safely to the afterlife. This is how I see Anubis, as a loyal friend who does not abandon us in one of the most delicate moments of life. Now think about how this protection extends beyond death. In many spiritual traditions, we believe that souls continue their journey, evolving and learning. Anubis, by guiding these souls, symbolizes this passage, showing that death is not an end but a transformation. This vision can help us deal with the pain of loss, understanding that our loved ones are under the protection of a guardian who loves and guides them. Mummification. Mummification is one of the most fascinating and complex processes in ancient Egyptian culture, and Anubis played a central role in this practice. For the Egyptians, mummification was not just a method of preserving the body, it was an essential preparation for the afterlife. They believed that in order for the spirit to live eternally, the body needed to be preserved in perfect condition. Here, Anubis, with his imposing and respectable figure, became not only a guide but an indispensable protector in this process. Initially, the body of the deceased was taken to a sacred place, where the priests, under the supervision of Anubis, began the mummification. One of the most intriguing aspects of this process was the removal of the internal organs, which were considered impure. Each of these organs was carefully removed and placed in jars, known as canopic jars, which were also consecrated to Anubis. He was seen as a kind of spiritual doctor, ensuring that each step was carried out correctly so that the deceased could enjoy a peaceful, eternal life. Personally, I have always been fascinated by how the Egyptians viewed death not as an end, but as a transformation. This view makes me reflect on our own relationship with death and how we often fear the unknown. Instead, Anubis teaches us that death is a passage, and mummification is a sacred ritual to ensure that this transition is made in the most dignified way possible. After the organs were removed, the body was dehydrated using natron, a substance that helped draw out moisture, preventing decomposition. This process took around 70 days, and Anubis was symbolically present at every stage. It was common for priests to perform prayers and rituals during mummification, invoking Anubis's protection and blessing. This shows the importance of spirituality in the lives of the Egyptians, an aspect that I believe still resonates strongly in many spiritual traditions. Today, weighing of the heart. The weighing of the heart is one of the most fascinating and meaningful rituals in ancient Egyptian religion, with Anubis playing a central role. This process not only symbolized the deceased's passage to the afterlife, but also reflected the Egyptians' belief in justice and morality in their life on earth. Throughout history, the idea that our actions have consequences is a theme that resonates deeply in many cultures. In the case of ancient Egypt, this practice was a way of ensuring that the afterlife was based on ethical principles. When we talk about the weighing of the heart, we are referring to a judgment that took place in Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Anubis, as the guardian and conductor of souls, was tasked with taking the deceased to the hall of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. Imagine the scene. The heart of the deceased, which represented their entire essence, was placed on a scale next to the feather of Ma'at. This feather symbolized truth and justice. If the heart was heavier than the feather, it meant that the person had committed many sins and was therefore unworthy of entering eternal life. On the other hand, if the heart was light, it indicated that the person had lived a virtuous life. This ritual teaches us a lot about the importance of integrity and character. As I reflect on my own life, I realize that the way we treat others, the choices we make, and the honesty with which we live are crucial not only to our reputation, but also to our souls. What would our hearts weigh today? This is a question we should all consider from time to time. The figure of Anubis may, with his jackal head, serves as a powerful symbol of protection and watchfulness. The jackal is an animal that is often associated with cemeteries, and its presence reinforced the idea that it was always watching, ensuring that souls were treated with respect and dignity. This watchfulness is a reminder that, even after death, there is continued care for the departed. Symbolism. The symbolism of Anubis is deeply rooted in ancient Egyptian culture, reflecting not only his role as a god of mummification and guardian of the dead, but also the way the Egyptians viewed life, death, and what came after. For many, Anubis was more than a deity. He represented the transition between two worlds, the physical and the spiritual. The image of Anubis with his jackal head is not merely an aesthetic choice. The jackal, an animal that often roamed cemeteries, symbolized vigilance. The presence of this animal in the fields of death was seen as a sign of protection as it fed on what was left. Thus, Anubis, as a central figure in this symbolism, not only guarded the dead, but also ensured that they were given due respect. This vigilance was essential in a culture that had a deep belief in an afterlife. When I look at the representation of Anubis, I feel a connection to the protection he offers, not only to the dead, but also to all of us who seek safety on our spiritual journeys. In addition, the jackal is also associated with transformation and rebirth. In Egyptian mythology, the idea that life does not end with death is a central concept. The presence of Anubis, as an intermediary between the worlds, emphasizes the belief that life continues in some form. This perspective can lead us to reflect on what it truly means to live. Life is a cycle, and each of us has a role in this journey, just as Anubis plays his. Worship Anubis, the jackal-headed Egyptian god, was not just a mythological figure. He was a living presence in the daily lives of the ancient Egyptians. The cult of Anubis was deeply rooted in Egyptian culture and manifested itself in many religious practices. From the earliest times of Egyptian civilization until the end of the empire, the worship of Anubis stood out, especially in relation to funerary rituals. This is because, for the Egyptians, death was not the end, but a transition to another form of existence, and Anubis played a crucial role in this journey. Temples dedicated to Anubis were located in various parts of Egypt, especially near necropolises and cemeteries. These sacred places were meeting points for the faithful, where rituals and offerings were performed in honor of the god. It was believed that by offering food, drink, and other items, the living could ensure the protection and guidance of Anubis for their departed loved ones. Personally, I have always been impressed by the depth of the connection that the ancient Egyptians had with their gods. especially in such delicate moments as death. During funerary ceremonies, the presence of Anubis was felt in every detail. The priests, often dressed in clothes reminiscent of in order to honor the god. They performed meticulous rituals that involved mummification and preparing the body for the journey to the afterlife. The figure of Anubis was evoked in prayers and songs, reinforcing the belief that he would protect and guide the soul of the deceased. This demonstrates not only the reverence for Anubis, but also the importance that Egyptian civilization placed on the afterlife. Artistic representations. Artistic representations of Anubis are fascinating and help us understand not only his importance in Egyptian mythology, but also how the art of the time reflected the beliefs and values of society. The god is often depicted with the head of a jackal and the body of a man, a combination that symbolizes both vigilance and connection with death. This iconography is not just aesthetic, it carries deep meanings that resonate to this day. When I look at the paintings and sculptures that represent Anubis, I realize that every detail is intentional. The colors used such as black, which symbolizes fertility and resurrection, and golden, which represents divinity, are choices that communicate the duality of life and death. The contrast between life and death is a central theme in Egyptian culture, and Anubis, as the guardian of the afterlife, encapsulates this duality perfectly. In addition to his appearance, Anubis' posture in artwork is equally significant. He is often depicted in a position that conveys protection and watchfulness. This depiction is not merely decorative, it suggests that he is ever present, watching over the souls that cross the threshold between this world and the next. This idea of protection is something many of us can relate to, especially when thinking about those who have passed on. The sense that there is a greater power watching over our loved ones can bring comfort in times of grief. Finally, artistic representations of Anubis remind us of the importance of honoring our ancestors and preserving their stories. They inspire us to reflect on our own journey and how we can somehow protect and guide those who come after us. Art thus becomes a powerful means of connection and continuity, transcending time and space. Cultural legacy. The cultural legacy of Anubis is fascinating and profound. When we consider the influences this deity has had throughout history, we realize that his presence extends far beyond the walls of ancient Egyptian temples. Anubis is not just a symbol of ancient Egypt, he has become an icon that resonates to this day in various forms of artistic and cultural expression. Another notable point is how Anubis appears in modern spiritual and esoteric practices. Many traditions of contemporary spirituality incorporate elements of Egyptian mythology, and Anubis is no exception. He is often invoked in rituals that aim for spiritual protection and connection with ancestors. This connection to the past is something that many of us, especially those in our 50s, can value. After all, as we grow older, we often become more aware of the importance of honoring our ancestors and seeking wisdom from their experiences. In addition, the worship of Anubis, which once filled the temples of Egypt with rituals and offerings, still echoes in some contemporary practices of worship and reverence. There are groups that gather to celebrate his story and his lessons, reaffirming respect for death and the cycle of life. This reminds us that, despite cultural and temporal differences, death is a universal experience that connects us all. Finally, the legacy of Anubis teaches us about the importance of memory. By honoring those who came before us, we find a sense of continuity and belonging. The figure of Anubis invites us to reflect on how we deal with death and what we do to keep the memory of those who have passed alive. Through his story, we are reminded that even in times of loss, there is always a path to light and protection. This is a legacy that transcends time and that, in a certain way, we can all carry in our hearts.